Welcome you all to this session on issues in urban development, reflections from South Asia. The organization of our presentation will be as follows. First, I will try to develop the research questions and unfold the analytical frame. Subsequently, I'll move on to the methodology and findings, and then I will talk about the policy gaps. Now, as far as the research questions are concerned, I think the most important issue relates to your industry and services and industry and urbanization nexus. The historical experience of the present-day developed nations suggested a strong nexus between industrial growth and urbanization. Industrial performance has been treated as the engine of growth, implying that equalization of industrial productivity can bring in equalization of economic growth across space. And regions with higher rates of urbanization reported higher rates of economic growth, thus bringing out a close nexus between industry and urban. However, this historical perception between industry and nexus has got distorted, and now we are able to see a strong nexus developing between industry and services. So whether services growth is sustainable and can it lead to sustainable urbanization are some of the important questions that are emerging. So the importance of the services sector, both for the educated and the uneducated job seekers at the place of destination, is evident. For the educated job market participants, the services sector offers high productivity work opportunities. On the other hand, for the uneducated workers, the services sector posits easy entry with very less barriers in terms of financial resources or skill requirements. In fact, way back in 1976, Woodall had pointed out that the services sector is a manifestation of residual type activities. However, in course of time, we are able to see that the services sector has a bimodal income distribution. So you get to see a concentration of some workers with very low levels of income, and again on the other side you are able to see another concentration of workers with very high levels of income. So it follows a bimodal distribution, suggesting that both the educated and the uneducated workers are trying to seek job opportunities in the services sector. Further, the recent literature suggests that even the less skilled workers are aiming at the services sector, as jobs in the industrial sector are almost disappearing. So from that point of view, particularly in the metropolitan cities, the services sector is pulling the migrants from the rural areas. Even for the less educated and unskilled workers, opportunities are opening up in the cities to escape poverty. So the so-called residual activities are also emerging to be a sector of respite. Some of the studies pointed out that there is a positive association between the services sector share in output and per capita income. And this is widely evident both in the countries with relatively low levels of per capita income and higher levels of per capita income. The first being made up of primarily of traditional services, and the second would comprise your modern services. Even in the countries, in the developing countries or countries with very low levels of per capita income, you are able to see that migrants are moving into the services sector, and there is a strong nexus between per capita income and services sector growth. However, on the whole, we are able to see that the employment growth in the Indian services sector has been quite modest. And not only in the Indian services sector, in many developing country contexts, given the fact that there has been a significant structural transformation towards the services sector, the employment growth has been pretty sluggish. So there are other factors too explaining a surge in the services sector value added. Productivity in manufacturing improved with growth of the economy, and the benefit of the improvement got passed on to the users, while the services sector did not experience such a consistent drag. Rather, education, health, etc. has been a consistent beneficiary of the price adjustment, which helped the service sector's share in GDP to move up persistently. Factors which compel poorer households to spend more on services also need to be looked into. Many poor households are spending a lot on essential services, including education, health, etc. So that has also contributed to the growth of the services sector. Now I move on to another important issue which relates to your agglomeration economies, productivity and growth. In the process of economic development, urbanization and industrialization share a close nexus, as I have pointed out. Not only industrialization leads to urbanization, but also urbanization has productivity augmenting effects on industry. So there is a bidirectional causality between industrialization and urbanization. So one is trying to pose this question that why urbanization will result in further industrialization. When production was predominantly agricultural in pre-industrial society, it occurred outside the cities. This pattern slowly got reversed as industrial revolution progressed. Manufacturing production emerged as the major activity occurring in inner city areas. On the whole, economic development not only caused a shift in the composition of growth and occupational structure, but also manifested itself in terms of locational shift of the population, resulting in urbanization. Within the urban areas, again you get to see that the large cities, because of agglomeration economies, manifesting themselves in terms of higher levels of productivity and technical efficiency, are again considered better than the medium-sized or small towns. So within the urban space, you get to see that large cities would offer greater opportunities and greater benefits compared to the medium-sized and the small towns. So a central question to the issue of optimal city size is therefore whether scale economies exist in urban production and whether urbanization has a positive influence on economic growth. So whether these agglomeration economies are actually translating in terms of higher levels of growth. Some industries are said to induce concentration of economic activity as they exhibit high economies of scale in operation. And some others benefit from concentration because of the operation of agglomeration economies. From concentration of activities, a new farm not only benefits in terms of forward and backward linkages, but complementary services also reduce its cost of operation. The effective price of infrastructure like power, water supply, roads, etc. gets reduced if there is concentration of users. Government action, however, mostly failed to recognize the merits of concentration, and this has often led to suboptimal utilization of resources. However, the impact of specific industrial location or regional policies on the actual location of industry has been quite limited in many developing countries. Concentration, of course, we do agree that after a certain stage will result in a lot of diseconomies of scale. So congestion, urban pollution will arise. So we are not trying to suggest that economies of scale will occur indefinitely. So there will be an intersection point of economies of scale and the diseconomies of scale. If you presume that the economies of scale are increasing at a decreasing rate, then you would be able to see an inverted U-shaped relationship between the population size and the economies of scale. On the other hand, if you presume that the diseconomies of scale are increasing at least at a constant rate, if not at an increasing rate, then naturally the straight line will intersect the inverted U-shaped curve. And that is usually considered to be the optimal city size. So the agglomeration economies were first put forth by Edwin Mills in his 1967 work and later on by Henderson. The external economies in general are divided into two categories: urbanization economies and localization economies. Of course, both of them result in productivity augmenting effects, but there are certain distinctions between the urbanization economies and the localization economies. Mills mainly had talked about the urbanization economies. So urbanization economies are external to both firm and industry, and result from the general level of economic activity in that city or increase in total city population. While strong urbanization economies may lead to the development of diversified large areas, localization economies foster specialized metropolitan areas if these economies occur in combination with possibilities of inter-area trade. So localization economies will suggest that each city should be specializing in the production of a specific activity. And then there should be intercity trade. So localization economies are external to the firm but internal to the industry. And they reflect economies of intra-industry specialization where greater industry size permits greater specialization among firms in their detailed functions. Labor market economies where industry size reduces search costs for firms looking for workers with specific training relevant to that industry. Scale of communication among firms affecting the speed of adoption of new innovations, and scale in providing public intermediate inputs tailored to the technical needs of a particular industry. So you are able to see that the information cost will be shared by a large number of firms, and similarly the labor turnover cost can also be reduced if most of the firms producing the similar kind of activity are concentrated in one particular space. The benefits of concentration can be attributed to the following factors, as Hermansen in his 1972 work had pointed out. So his contention was that substantial economies of investment expenditure, that is one which is associated with concentration. The investment for the whole complex is less than the sum of investment for each enterprise planned and located in isolation. So by concentrating, actually one is able to reduce the cost of investment. Efficient production due to advantages of specialization, economies of large-scale operation and organization of common managerial and infrastructural facilities, possibility of jointly exploiting of the natural and raw material resources of the area of location, and opportunities for close contact, rapid diffusion of technological innovations, and rapid overall development of the economy. So these are the benefits which are associated with concentration. The technological progress that the world is witnessing at a rapid pace is now accessible to all areas thanks to the communication technology. However, its implementation and utilization at the fullest level is possible only when the support structure in terms of highly skilled manpower, adequate infrastructural facilities, and the overall governance exists significantly. Since the large cities are usually better off from this angle, the outcomes are also more profitable. Ancillarization and subcontracting possibilities are sizable in large cities as the number of firms is large and they tend to encourage interdependency in an attempt to pursue super specialization and reduced cost. Hence, both productivity and wages are expected to be much higher in large cities compared to the medium-sized and small towns. So you are able to see that within the urban space, again, the large cities will be much better off in relation to the agglomeration benefits in terms of wages and also in terms of levels of living. At least these are the theoretical underpinnings which are following from the theoretical models suggested by Edwin Mills, Henderson, and many other works which were undertaken subsequently. Better levels of living in cities. So if we are trying to argue that there can be higher wages as well as productivity in large cities, then naturally one would expect that there would be better levels of living in large cities compared to the medium-sized and small towns. Given the possibilities of higher returns to investment and per capita incomes in large cities, it is important to verify if the well-being levels of those in the lower rungs are higher compared to their counterparts in small towns. So one would like to verify whether the slum dwellers in large cities are actually better off compared to the slum dwellers in medium-sized or small towns. Whether the low-income households, the so-called low-income households, are able to access better opportunities, are whether able to access educational and health facilities in the large cities compared to their counterparts in small towns and medium-sized towns. So there are direct and indirect linkages exist through which the growth effects from one sector can percolate down to reach other peripheral sectors. The secondary effects are not just confined to the domain of employment generation. They may have spillover effects in the areas of education and health as well. As workers in large cities can afford better quality education and health, the private suppliers of these services are also motivated to situate themselves in the large cities. So you get to see that the suppliers and the consumers, all of them will be concentrating in the large cities. Since the large cities are characterized by higher levels of productivity, the real wages are also higher therein, as we had suggested a little while ago. Even in the informal sector, the wages due to forward and backward linkages between the sectors are higher. In fact, in a general equilibrium framework, it can be conveniently demonstrated how the gains in the high productivity segments get transmitted to other sectors in the economy. Particularly in the work of Mills, Baker and Williamson, you get to see that how the high productivity segments are having positive spillover effects on the rest of the economy. So numbers and size distribution. So when you are talking about urban space, you are able to see that there are different types of cities and towns. And there is a typical relationship between the numbers of cities and towns and the size of the cities and towns. And that is what is called as your rank size rule. So this rank size rule is basically trying to verify whether there is unification or there is diversification. By unification, we mean that there is concentration of activities, concentration of market, concentration of suppliers, concentration of consumers. By diversification, we mean that many cities, many towns must be growing simultaneously. So the relative numbers of jth type cities to the first type cities are determined by their relative shares in consumer budgets, relative labor intensities and relative degree of scale economies. So rank size or geometric series rule governing the numbers of each type of city convey information about how underlying demand and supply parameters must vary across types of cities. So if we just consider the rank of the cities in terms of their population size and the numbers of cities and towns belonging to a particular size class, we will be able to reflect a lot about convergence and divergence that is taking place. Usually in the literature we have read that convergence is a desirable thing. That means many areas will be catching up with each other, many areas should be growing simultaneously. But here the urban economists are trying to say that when there is unification, there is concentration or there is divergence, it is able to use the resources optimally. So the size distribution of cities is not an accident of nature, but is directly linked to the regional composition of output and production conditions. The framework most commonly employed to study city or town sizes is based on Pareto distribution, where you say Gx could be the rank of the city, is equal to A x to the power minus A. X is the population size of a particular category of city. Okay. So where Gx is the number of urban areas with at least X people, and capital A and small a are the parameters to be estimated from the data. So the Gx can be rank of the city, also can be the number of urban areas with a population size of X. So Pareto distribution can be estimated by computing the least square regression of log of Gx is equal to log of A minus A log X. So one would like to empirically verify whether small a, that is the coefficient of log x, is equal to 1 or greater than 1. If it is greater than 1, it would mean that unification is taking place. The large cities are growing much faster compared to the medium-sized and small towns. Okay. So if if A is estimated to be 1, then xgx will be equal to A. And what is capital A? Capital A is the product of an urban area's rank and population, which is a constant. And it is equal to the population of the largest urban area. So the rank size rule implies that the second largest city will have half of the population of the largest city. And similarly, the third largest city will have 1/3 of the population of the largest city in the country. So as if A is estimated to be 1, then there is full utilization of the investment. And in fact, if A is estimated to be greater than 1, then one could suggest that lot of concentration unification is taking place. So the resources which are invested in a particular space, they are being optimally utilized. On the other hand, if A is less than 1, then you are able to see that the resources are not optimally utilized. There is diversification taking place. Of course, diversification means convergence. Many other areas, many other spatial areas are experiencing growth, and that is the reason why it is getting diversified. So diversification is desirable from one standpoint, but here for the urban economists, it is more important to see whether rank size distribution is being followed by a particular country. If it is taking place, then it would mean that resources are utilized to the best possible extent. And if A is greater than 1, as I mentioned to you, then it would mean that primacy is taking place. That means in the entire nation, just a few largest cities are dominating the entire economic scene, which has certain positive consequences and also has certain negative implications. The next issue involves about estimating the city domestic product. So in the first part of our presentation, we could suggest that the large cities would always figure in as the most important spaces. They will be contributing to the productivity growth, and also the levels of living can be higher in the large cities. So the second question immediately emerges, that how do we estimate the city product, city domestic product that is originating from the large cities? For planning at the national level, and more specifically to arrive at the estimates of urban infrastructure requirements, we need to know the contributions of cities to total population and their interaction with the rest of the economy. If the large cities are contributing significantly to the productivity growth at the national level, then obviously they should be drawing more resources in terms of investment. And for that, these background exercises are very important. The low-income households in the rural areas also have to benefit in the process of urban-centric growth. So we have to see that the investment must take place in such a manner that it will benefit those who are residing within the city space and also those who are located in the outskirts of the city. And how new linkages and institutions can be created to ensure pro-poor growth is an endemic feature of urban planning. So from this point of view, we are obviously obsessed to estimate the city domestic product. So usually we're top-down approach, because the bottom approach is more difficult to be implemented. It would mean that you will have to undertake a huge survey, a primary survey for each of the economic activities that are being undertaken in the city space. And that is a very costly affair. So the top-down approach is like this, that you collect information at the country level, then you try to arrive at the distinction of the domestic product in terms of rural and urban spaces, and then from there you try to work out the productivity adjustments and come to the city-specific domestic product. So one estimate is that when you are talking about urban domestic product, let's say the national domestic product is given to us, and from which we want to derive the urban domestic product. So urban domestic product is equal to total domestic product multiplied by the proportion of urban workers to total workers. Total workers means urban plus rural workers, and multiplied by urban productivity divided by all areas productivity. In the first part of our presentation, as I drew your attention to the fact that urban areas are supposedly more productive compared to the rural areas because of the external economies of scale. So the workers who are located in the urban space are more productive compared to their counterparts in the rural areas. So from that point of view, we cannot assume that the workers in the rural and urban areas are equally productive. That is the reason why we have to consider urban productivity relative to all areas productivity. Now, how do we derive the information on urban productivity vis-a-vis rural productivity? Because we have information on national domestic product, and it is not given to us for rural and urban areas separately. So unless we have the information on rural and urban areas value added, we cannot work out the labor productivity for the urban areas and the rural areas separately. So here we will have to make certain assumptions. We will presume that the productivity is related to wages. So the wages can be taken as the proxy for the productivity. So since we don't have information on the ratio of urban productivity to all areas productivity, we may consider the urban wages by all area wages as a replacement of this factor. Okay. So then urban domestic product will be equal to total domestic product multiplied by the proportion of urban workers to total workers and multiplied by the urban wages to all area wages. From this, now we have derived the urban domestic product. Now, from urban domestic product, obviously we will like to estimate the city domestic product. So, city domestic product will be equal to urban domestic product multiplied by city workers divided by total urban workers multiplied by city productivity divided by urban productivity. Again, city productivity is not known to us. So we may replace it by city wages divided by urban wages. So in this manner, we may work out the domestic product for each of the cities and each of the towns. And we can verify whether the large cities are actually contributing to the national domestic product to a large extent or not. Now I draw your attention to another important issue which relates to migration, informal sector, poverty and slums. The agglomeration views, the agglomeration literature as we discussed, they are basically one-sided. There is an equally strong contestable literature suggesting considerable overlaps between informal sector employment and poverty in large cities. In fact, Husserl's way back in 1950s had suggested that there can be a deterioration in the land-man ratio in the rural areas. As population growth takes place, there will be excess burden on the land in the rural areas. So many people will be forced to migrate to the urban space in search of jobs. So then Aristotle framework suggested that people will be migrating to the urban areas because the urban wages are higher than the rural wages. Rural poverty would obviously push people out from the rural areas to the urban areas. Now, as they migrate to the urban areas, they obviously look for job opportunities in the high productivity industrial sector. But if the high productivity industrial sector is not growing rapidly, or even if it is growing rapidly, there is adoption of capital intensive technology, then what would be the consequence? Naturally, they will all be getting residually absorbed in the low productivity informal sector. Low productivity informal sector would mean that they will be receiving meager earnings and they will be overlapping with urban poverty. So you are able to see that urban poverty is nothing but a spillover of rural poverty. The rural migrants have migrated to the urban space and now they are overlapping with informal sector employment and poverty. So slum problems need not be identified as housing problem, rather an outcome of employment problem. Often we try to characterize slum problem in terms of housing problem, but if you try to look at these links as in the light of Husserl's framework or Aristotle framework, you will be able to see that there is a connection between urban poverty and rural poverty. Urban slums and rural poverty. So this would mean that urban slums actually need to be characterized in terms of employment problem. So within the informal sector, possibilities of upward mobility, whether exist or don't exist, is an important question. If they don't exist, then a crucial question comes up that why the migrants are still staying in the urban space. Why don't they return to the rural areas? So hence factors explaining the mobility must be identified. What determines migration? In what way the urban job market information is accessed? Whether migration is associated with strong payoffs and who would migrate are important questions. Similarly, whether migration results in remittances and how the remittances are spent by the rural households encompass a great deal of discussion. Consumption smoothing and rural investment are some of the important aspects on which the literature has gained momentum. While rural investment is instrumental to long-term gains, consumption support drawn from remittances is rather seen as short-term benefits. So whether actually rural investment is taking place out of remittances or not is an important question, which needs to be empirically verified. Migration of educated individuals both from rural to urban and urban to urban are less researched issues. We have primarily focused on the migration of the low-income households from the rural areas to the urban areas. The return to education, in fact, is closely dependent on the possibility to migrate. The rural to rural migration in search of jobs and urban to rural return migration at the end of the job career, particularly in the light of land and housing scarcity in large cities, also need to be explored. Now, when we say that people migrate from the rural areas to the urban space, an important question comes up that how do they access the job market information while they are still residing in the rural areas? So it is in this context the network literature becomes very important. It has been widely observed that among the low-income households, the existence of social networks for accessing job market information is widely prevalent. In fact, these networks are the basis for their survival strategy. So these networks would operate along the lines of caste kinship bonds through close relatives, friends, co-villagers, members of the same caste group, and so on. So without such network, they are not able to access the information pertaining to the urban job market, and hence they will not be able to migrate by reducing their cost. It can be very extremely costly if they do not have that information beforehand. So in what way these networks actually contribute to their welfare gains is an important question. There are different types of studies which have come up. Some people have tried to suggest that network concentration leads to lack of upward mobility. On the other hand, some of the studies have pointed out that network diversification actually contributes to upward mobility. So what is network concentration? This would mean that if a person continues to access the similar type of network prior to migration and also after migration at the place of destination, then he is not able to access a great amount of information. There will be information asymmetry and there will be labor market segmentation. So as a result, the person will have only limited information pertaining to what has been provided by his contact person. So indirectly, the contact person and the newcomer are actually competing for the same job unknowingly. So that would mean that the extent of experiencing upward mobility will be restricted both for the contact person as well as for the newcomer. So from that point of view, the literature has suggested that network diversification is crucial to experiencing upward mobility. So if the newcomers uses, let us say in the first stage, the information provided by the relatives, but later on, as he continues to stay in the urban space, he diversifies his networks. He diversifies his friendship and he gains information from many other sources. So in that way, his mobility across space within the city and also occupational mobility and income mobility becomes much faster. So network diversification is said to be instrumental to upward mobility. Now another important point relates to demand for land and amenities. Much larger issues relating to urban development arise as the competition between business and residents grows stronger for space. So at a point will come, you would find that the consumers and the suppliers both are competing with each other for space. And there can be a third party also, the transport service providers. So on the one hand, business provides opportunities without which an urban space would cease to be dynamic or generate any economic value. Thus, the land scarcity starts arising, and in the backdrop of this, the households with lesser paying capacity tend to get eliminated. And that is the reason why you get to see that there can be vast stretches of slums. Even the unauthorized holdings are demolished and land is used for lucrative purposes. The gated communities and also the malls will come up, demolishing the slums and unauthorized holdings. In a free market economy, the probability of money laundering and speculation in the land market is very high, which makes land distribution much more unequal. In such situations, what intervention should be made to reduce the inequality and to ensure the right to shelter to the low-income households and especially the migrants is a key question. Whether the low-income households value the urban services, and if so, in what way the prices of the utilities can be worked out, are very important issues. There is a view in the urban economics literature that the slum dwellers, the low-income households, are the parasites, but that is not correct. A study was done by Yujiro Hayami and other scholars in the context of the garbage pickers in Delhi, and they pointed out that the garbage pickers are actually contributing to the city domestic product hugely in comparison to the income that they are able to earn. So the value added that they were creating was much more than their earnings, and hence the study had suggested that infrastructural support should be provided to these low-income households. So there are a variety of such activities, and these slum dwellers, they are actually contributing to the growth of the city in a very economic manner. So from that point of view, it is not really true to suggest that they are parasites. So from that point of view, it becomes necessary for the government to provide certain services to the slum dwellers. Of course, we do agree that providing certain amenities free of cost can pose a huge burden on the public exchequer. So it would be essential to figure out whether the low-income households are also willing to contribute to the provision of certain basic services. And empirical studies have pointed out that actually they are willing to pay, they are willing to share the cost of the services which are to be provided by the local governments. So these are also important issues. The other important question relates to transformation. Then when we are talking about urbanization, it is associated with modernization. So it is not just the regional shift of the population. It is not just the change in the composition of value added or change in the composition of workforce. It also relates to transformation, modernization of culture, ideology, etc. So to what extent the caste and occupation nexus tends to get eroded in the urban context is a pertinent question. Better connectivity, cheap transport system, and the availability of alternative modes of transport help individuals commute faster, which does not restrict them to secure jobs in the neighborhood of where they reside. So that from that point of view, one can imagine a huge transformation in the socio-economic life of an individual. The anonymity of individuals, particularly from the point of view of those who belong to disadvantaged castes, helps break the legacy of the caste-based occupations in a large city. In the rural areas, you would find that there is a close nexus between caste and occupation, but that is not expected to happen in the urban context. The sense of urbanism is supposedly more prevalent in large cities, which help people overcome the barriers of caste and other social hindrances and follow a more market-oriented approach. From all this, it may be inferred that individuals across various socioeconomic sections benefit in terms of accessing sustainable livelihood more in a large urban settlement vis-a-vis the rural areas or the small towns. The caste occupation nexus tends to break down and social transformation is a mooted outcome. Similarly, whether gender disparities tend to get dissipated with urban development is an important research question. So whether gender Kuznets curve in response to urban development and growing opportunities enters the flattening portion or the declining portion of the curve is an important concern. Now let me draw your attention to some of the newly emerging issues. Undermining the importance of agglomeration economies, it is noted that the territorial division of labor between the urban and the rural areas is on the decline, particularly in the developed countries. Similarly, the differences between the economic structure in large urban settlements and that in medium-sized towns are about to disappear, lending little relevance to the agglomeration literature that we were talking about. However, within the countries of Asia and the Pacific, despite a decline in poverty across the rural and the urban areas, there are significant disparities between urban and rural areas and between regions within countries. In the backdrop of globalization, the rural-urban distinction in sources of livelihood has grown much sharper. Economic globalization, in an attempt to reap the cost advantages, has motivated firms to diversify the production base across different countries depending on resource availability, and this has led today to the emergence of a multi-centric world economy as opposed to a center and a periphery model of the earlier phase. So what you were able to see that industrial and services hubs have emerged in a few locations which already had rich infrastructural base and could subsequently attract further investment in those areas. So on the whole, economic globalization has contributed to concentration of non-agricultural activities in the urban areas, and again, within the urban localities, the external economies of scale are operating only in a few locations due to unequal distribution of investment. So what you get to see that there convergence may be taking place. Different countries are perhaps trying to catch up because they are all involved in that global production network. But within a given country, your inequality is rising, the spatial inequality is rising, the divergence is taking place. While across countries convergence may be taking place, within a given country divergence is taking place. The rich regions are getting richer, because by doing that, the governments know that they will be able to reduce the cost of operation, and the firms know that they will be able to maximize their profits. So the rural hinterland of the big cities, it is undergoing fast transformations. The already large cities are drawing further rounds of investment, and therefore the rural hinterland is undergoing a huge transformation. So many satellite towns are emerging in the periphery of the large cities, and these towns often lack infrastructural facilities and do not have urban local bodies. The urban activities are getting shifted from the core city to the emerging new urban space, but are these activities able to absorb the rural population in the hinterland? The land use pattern has changed. The agricultural land is being used for non-agricultural purposes. The rural population has foregone its sources of livelihood. But then the new urban towns which are coming up in the rural hinterland of the big cities are whether able to absorb the rural population productively or not is an important question. In the process of reaping the agglomeration benefits, obviously concentration goes up, and as concentration goes up, urban pollution, congestion will be rising. So that brings in a deterioration in the urban environment. Also, there are stories about crime and violence. Rural-urban inequality is on the rise. In the process of urbanization, it may get accentuated. In an attempt to reap the benefits of agglomeration economies, interspatial inequality has increased. Globalization in an attempt to minimize cost by taking. Okay, so we will have to look at the well-being issues and the duration of migration. So as people continue to stay in the urban areas, to what extent they are able to improve their well-being levels. Now, there are other challenges as well, that particularly when you discuss the housing and land market, how do you quantify the land market? How do you work out the prices for different types of land in the city are some of the important challenges. Determining prices for various services. This has been attempted through hedonic models, which we will discuss soon. But still there are certain challenges. So different components of the informal sector, as I was mentioning, that some of them are stagnant and some of them are dynamic, and that needs to be worked out. Now let us come to discuss various methodologies. A wide range of methodologies have been used to examine these issues. One is your simultaneous equation model. And also computable general equilibrium models have been used. The mechanisms of impact of one set of variables on another not being very distinct, the people have now returned to the simultaneous equation model. So in the simultaneous equation model, you are able to look at the relationship, for example, between rural poverty and urban poverty. So if rural poverty is high, it will have a spillover effect on migration, and then migration will result in, let's say, a rise in the incidence of informal sector employment, and which may result in urban poverty. So what is the elasticity of urban poverty with respect to rural poverty? So this particular question can be addressed in terms of a recursive model, which is a special case of a simultaneous equation model. Of course, the computable general equilibrium models are able to address a variety of issues, but then in certain places it's a black box. One doesn't know exactly the mechanisms through which a particular outcome is getting generated. So there has been a return to the simultaneous equation models, and the scholars have tried to develop simultaneous equations models for a particular issue and for a particular sector, instead of having an economy-wide model. Similarly, the industry-urban nexus, or the emerging models of urban services nexus and its impact on rural-urban migration, are again addressed in a small simultaneous equation system with 3 equations or so. So let's say you have a migration function, then a macro migration function, then you have a macro migration function, and then you try to assess its impact on the services sector, and to what extent the services sector is pulling the migrants from the rural areas, and what repercussions it is having on urban poverty. The role of the inequality reducing factors like provision of health, infrastructure, and its accessibility for women, and preconditions which encourage women work participation rate to improve are identified within such framework. So you have, on the one hand, you have a link between the service sector and the migration and poverty. On the other hand, you also can address some of these important factors like health, education, and the factors which encourage women to participate in the labor market, and whether that is enabling the households to reduce poverty. The elasticity coefficients derived from the reduced form version of the structural models enable us to do the simulation and forecasting, and also helps us evaluate the policy effectiveness and the relative importance of various alternate interventions. The interesting part is that the impact of all the exogenous variables in the model can be worked out on each of the endogenous variables, even though in the structural form each equation did not include all of them. The direct and indirect effect of the exogenous variables on the endogenous variables, as derived from the reduced form estimates, make more sense than the structural parameters. Now, the panel data models based on simultaneous equation structure are also of great utility. Panel data models are used very extensively, particularly in the context of analyzing urbanization and development. The bidirectional causality, which would involve a simultaneous structure and would also use panel data, are very interesting. Across countries and over time, the linkages between trade, urbanization and development indicators are examined. The simultaneous equation models based on panel data are more interesting and challenging because you simply cannot apply the fixed effect and the random effect model and be satisfied with that. Because it is a simultaneous structure, you may have to first derive the reduced form version and apply the three alternative techniques of OLS, fixed effect and the random effect to the reduced form system. And based on the Hausman statistic and Lagrange multiplier statistic, you work out the appropriateness of the model. And then from the reduced form estimates, you generate the estimated values of the endogenous variables, which will be used in the structural model to replace their observed values on the right hand side. And then again you apply the three methods of OLS, fixed effect and random effect. So what you are doing, basically you are retaining the principle of two-stage least square, but at the same time, because they are based on panel data, you are applying the fixed effect and random effect also. Factor and cluster analysis. While dealing with a wide range of variables on different aspects, factor analysis is considered to be an appropriate tool. Particularly the district level urbanization, rural specific characteristics and the urban related variables are studied closely and the interlinkages are retrieved to substantiate several theoretical underpinnings. In fact, the factor analysis can be treated as a substitute to a large simultaneous equation system. Based on factor analysis, the cluster analysis can be carried out in order to delineate groups of observations which have similar characteristics. So one can actually look at the overlaps between geography, culture and socio-economic development. Also based on the factor analysis, indices can be formed and they can be then related to many other important indicators. The non-parametric technique can be taken. Technique can be taken recourse to for assessing the relationship between city size and index of well-being, for example. Then I draw your attention to your productivity estimations. Productivity estimation, okay, we have been arguing that the urban areas are more productive compared to the rural areas, and within the urban areas, the large cities are more productive than the medium-sized and small towns. So if that is the case, we must have productivity estimates for the large cities and also for the medium-sized and small towns, so that we are able to make a correct comparison. So how do we estimate technical efficiency? So technical efficiency can be estimated by using stochastic function framework, or you can also apply the data envelopment analysis. Cross-section estimates of technical efficiency and its association with locational characteristics is one way of verifying the links, though the calculation of technical efficiency will have to make assumption about the distributional property of the one-sided error term, that you may have to assume that it follows a half normal distribution or gamma distribution or exponential distribution. Alternately, you can estimate a time varying technical efficiency and total factor productivity growth. In fact, total factor productivity growth can be conceptualized in terms of technological progress plus the change in technical efficiency. So if you have the panel data, you can actually work out the total factor productivity growth at the city level and also the decomposition of total factor productivity growth in terms of technological progress and change in technical efficiency over time. And after estimating the performance specific indicators, factor analysis can be conducted in relation to many other variables such as unemployment rate, per capita income and other development indicators, so that you are able to understand whether the productivity growth is having certain positive spillover effects on other indicators or not. Using stochastic function framework, population pressure has been estimated for different types of cities and towns. It's almost like envisaging a cost frontier. So you are trying to figure out whether the actual population is much above the frontier level population. The frontier level population is taken to be a function of the volume of employment, the quantum, the composition of employment, and also the infrastructure endowment of the space. So if the actual population lies much above the frontier level of population, then you will say that these cities or these urban spaces are actually having lot of very huge population pressure. So in fact, with Indian data, when we were trying to pursue this exercise for different types of cities and towns, we could see that the small towns and the medium-sized towns in the backward states were actually having a very high population pressure. And the demographers were not actually correct. The demographers would suggest that the large cities would have a very huge population pressure. No, the large cities are large because they can accommodate such large population. They have economies of scale, they have employment opportunities, they also have the infrastructure endowment. Also, the binomial and multinomial logit models have been used very extensively. For example, when you are trying to estimate an occupational choice model, or you are trying to estimate the migration function using the household level data. So what are the factors that would result in a particular outcome is the key question that you are posing. So what are the factors that would result in migration? Or what are the factors that would result in a particular in selecting a particular occupation? These are some of the important indicators, and as you know, the multinomial logit models cannot be interpreted directly. The coefficients cannot be interpreted directly. So you will have to interpret the log odds ratio or the marginal effects. Decomposition analysis has also been used. The decomposition analysis, particularly the ones which are based on regression. Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition exercise, for example. The difference between the urban income and the rural income can be placed in terms of three important factors. The first component explains the endowment effects, that is due to differences in the predictors. The predictors are different in the rural areas and the urban areas, so that may be having an impact on the outcome variable. The second component explains the differences in the coefficients, to what extent the indicators are actually having an impact on the outcome. That could be quite different in the rural areas vis-a-vis the urban areas. And the third component explains interaction term, accounting for the fact that differences in endowments and coefficients exist simultaneously between the urban and rural households. Now, I discuss a very interesting methodology, that is hedonic demand functions. The hedonic model estimation is a two-step procedure. The hedonic equation is specified first, which is called the first stage of model estimation. A measure of housing price is regressed against all housing attributes using the best fitting functional form. In the second stage, the demand function for housing attribute is estimated by using the partial derivative with respect to a housing attribute as the dependent variable, and quantity of housing attributes, some measure of the consumer's income, taste, etc. are used as independent variables. In order to determine the implicit price of an attribute, or the price that the consumers may be willing to pay on an average for a particular attribute, can be determined as the coefficient of the attribute in the log transformation of the housing price equation multiplied by the price of the aggregate housing. Now, let me draw your attention to some of the important findings. Obviously, it will not be possible to discuss the findings in detail, just a couple of broad findings. The findings comprise a great degree of similarity across countries in South Asia. The interspatial inequality and income inequality are on the rise alongside economic growth. So economic growth has escalated, but at the same time inequality has been rising, and more importantly the spatial inequality is on the rise. So rising urbanization is accompanied by rising concentration. agglomeration benefits exist, and part of this is passed on to the labor in the lower rungs as well. Hence, poverty tends to decline in large cities. So we are able to see that the incidence of poverty in large cities is relatively smaller compared to the incidence of poverty in medium-sized or small towns. However, the beneficial outcomes of urbanization are not substantial, partly because the formal-informal linkages are dominated by a wide range of intermediaries. Even when the formal-informal sector interlinkages exist, you are able to see that the intermediaries try to squeeze the profit margin, and hence the informal sector workers are not able to get their due share. Besides, the urban land and housing market is dominated by speculative activities, reducing the accessibility of many to housing and basic amenities. So the low income households and the lower middle income households, they completely get pushed out from the cities. As far as policies are concerned, urban policy interventions have been wide, though a great deal still seems to be pending. Urban poverty programs have witnessed major changes from its rural approach to urban initiative. In the initial years, people had suggested that if you take care of the rural development programs, it will automatically take care of the urban slums and informal sector employment and urban poverty. So they were basically trying to assess the link between the rural poverty and the urban poverty. And they were of the view that urban poverty is nothing but a spillover of rural poverty. But when we try to quantify these statements and we try to assess the empirical relevance of these theoretical underpinnings, we are able to see that the elasticity of urban poverty with respect to rural poverty is extremely low. So which would mean that rural poverty is adding to urban poverty at the margin, but that doesn't mean that the entire stock of urban poor can be interpreted as fresh spillover from the rural areas. If that is the case, then naturally you cannot solve the urban poverty problem by implementing the rural development programs. Even if the rural development schemes are implemented with all sincerity, the urban poverty would continue to persist. So from that point of view, the relevance of urban employment guarantee programs come to the forefront, though we have not yet implemented in many countries. Similarly, the slum problems have been seen as employment problem rather than housing problem, though the informal sector strategy is yet to become a key aspect of urban development initiative. Often the urban planners would equate the slum problem with housing problem. But the researchers have noted that slum problem is not just the housing problem. It's more of an employment problem. And for that, the informal sector strategy needs to be worked out. And the informal sector strategy has not been implemented in many countries. So on the whole, we are able to see that urban policy is quite inadequate in scope. It has been primarily left to the city planners and the geographers to sort of model a particular city. But we do realize that urban economies have a great deal to contribute. Efforts need to be initiated in such a manner that urban policy would also benefit the rural areas. This is a very important question, that the investment in the city has to take place in such a manner so that the hinterland and many other remote rural areas should also benefit from that investment. To what extent the positive spillover can be created is an important question, and that falls into the domain of policy making, effective policy making. Agriculture, rural non-farm and city-specific activities, all three will have to be in balance. So again, within the rural non-farm sector, you may find a demand-induced component and a supply-push phenomenon. So how to sort of reduce the supply-push phenomenon and how to promote the demand-induced component is a very important question. And how these demand-induced component within the rural non-farm sector can be connected to the activities which are conducted in the cities is the key question. housing and economic activities, a proper balance will have to be maintained. We agree that the economic activities involve a lot of agglomeration benefits, but at the same time, some space will have to be left for housing. And housing not just for the upper middle class and the rich, housing for the low income households and also for the lower middle income households. In what way the housing reservation policy can be introduced in the housing market is a key question. Agglomeration benefits, but at the same time balanced urbanization is also important. We do agree that agglomeration economies are very important to experience resource saving economic growth, but it may result in highly special inequality. So from that point of view, it is important to vouch for balanced urbanization. So once a particular city has reached a saturation point, the suggestion is that further rounds of investment should not be carried out within the same space. Rather, other second tier and third tier cities should come up to receive those new rounds of investment, so that they also generate more agglomeration benefits, and at the same time then the country can also experience somewhat balanced urbanization. Policies to decide on the location of industries is very important. As we were discussing, that the core city is refusing to locate the industries anymore because of the rise in the congestion, because of rise in urban pollution. So where the industries should be located? There has been deindustrialization in many of the developing countries, particularly if you look at the urban space. So industry and urban is not having anymore a strong nexus. So in that context, which particular locations should be reserved for industries without harming the balance between industrialization and urbanization is a key question. Housing colonies will have to be built, but as I was mentioning, they should not be built only for the upper middle class households or the rich households, and it should not be implemented at the expense of the low income households. So in other words, we must experience inclusive urbanization. As I mentioned a little while ago, it is wrong to suggest that the low income households are not contributing to city domestic product. They are actually contributing to a large extent. So from that point of view, they also have a right over the urban space. So in what way the space can be created for the low income households is very important. So policies to discourage exclusionary urbanization. So on the one hand, inclusive urbanization policies need to be pursued, and the policies in the past which have encouraged exclusionary urbanization must be discontinued. The transport policy, that also has to be very, very inclusive. Different types of transport modes exist. So to create transport modes only for the upper middle class or for the rich communities will be quite unjustified. So from that point of view, to what extent a new transport policy is inclusive is an important question. So on the whole, we have discussed various research questions in the context of urban economic development in South Asia. We also talked about the various methodologies, and very briefly I mentioned some of the important findings, and finally we got into the policy questions. Hope there is a lot of space to do further research in this area. Thank you very much for your attention.